So thanks everyone for joining us for this panel. We have an hour to talk about something that could take much, much longer, but we will do our very best. This is a panel on election subversion and in particular, the role of state legislatures in the fight for our democracy. I'm Gaby Goldstein. I'm one of our co-founders at Sister District, where our mission is to build progressive power in state legislatures. And we started the organization in late 2016 because we saw a gap in organizing capacity and resources, frankly, in interest, going to folks running for this level of the ballot and serving at this level of government. And, we knew that state legislatures were extremely overlooked historically by progressives and Democrats. But I don't think that we could have even imagined the critical role that state legislatures would come to play in the fight for our democracy itself, which of course is the topic of this panel and is unfortunately more timely by the day. And certainly, this has been an overlooked venue of power on our side, at least, of course, 100 years worth of strategy and planning has gone into the capture of state legislatures on the right. But this is truly where the fight for our democracy is. This is the venue of power where gerrymandering comes from. It doesn't come from anywhere at the federal level. It comes from state legislatures. Critical role in fair elections, in fair districts, of course, in voting rights, particularly with the narrowing of federal civil rights protections that we're seeing occur through this Supreme Court and at the federal level. So with these broad trends in law and policy that are really narrowing the scope of federal rights and expanding the power of states, we are in what I think is a moment of ascendancy for states. And it's going to be absolutely critical in the immediate term and in the longer term for progressives and for Democrats to pay a lot more attention immediately. And, we've seen that over the past several months, I think. The Republicans have really shown us their playbook for not just 2022, but 2024. And it involves using their unearned legislative majorities in state legislatures to rewrite the rules, to sow seeds of distrust in our elections, and to, as I said, change the rules to ensure that they win regardless of the vote. So, this is a timely topic, and I'm absolutely delighted to have our panelists with us. Really a perfect time and a perfect place here in Pennsylvania, which, has been a hotbed for big liars and a lot of the election subversion tactics that I think that, we're seeing all over the place. So briefly, just want to introduce our panelists. We have Cecilia Aguilera, who's counsel at Fair Election Center, where she represents voters, returning citizens, and civic engagement organizations in impact litigation to remove barriers to voting and restore the right to vote. We have David Daley, who is the author of Rat Fucked, apologies if that's meant to be bleeped out, which was a seminal text on gerrymandering that really helped spark the drive to reform redistricting in this country. Frequent lecturer and media source about gerrymandering and voting, a former editor-in-chief of Salon.com. We have Carmen Lopez, who is the Senior Democracy Director at the State Innovation Exchange. She previously served as Democracy Policy Officer at the Thornburg Foundation, Deputy Cabinet Secretary at the New Mexico Higher Education Department, and held other roles, including in U.S. Congress and other federal government roles. And then finally, last but certainly not least, we have Malcolm Kenyatta, who is the representative for the 181st District here in Pennsylvania. He's vice chair of the Philadelphia delegation, who is the first openly LGBTQ plus person of color and one of the youngest people ever elected to the General Assembly here in Pennsylvania. Absolutely committed to creating an equitable and inclusive society, and in 2022, he became the first LGBTQ man of color to ever run for the U.S. Senate. So absolutely delighted to have this panel of folks who have really had and continue to have a front seat to the election subversion plans, tactics, and implementation that we're seeing happen on the ground everywhere. So just to take briefly through what we're going to talk about, we're first going to spend a little bit of time on the state of play, current state of play, sort of what we're seeing on the ground, what's sort of happening right now and what to watch for. And then I think we'll spend a little bit of time talking about how we got here. What the factors are that led us to this moment of state ascendancy and in which progressives are underprepared for the moment, as well as what we can do about it, right? I mean, I think that all is not lost. The time is short and grows shorter by the day, but there's still a tremendous amount of leverage that we have if we really pay attention and we're strategic with our energy and our resources. And, spend a little bit of time thinking about this year and some calls to action that we can all take to do our part to elevate the importance of, the role of state legislatures and their importance in our democracy, and to make an impact in this critical midterm year. So with that, let's kick things off and talk a little bit about the current state of play. So, certainly at a broad level, we know that the Republican Party is engaged in election subversion design and planning ahead of this year's midterm elections and the 2024 elections. Curious to learn a little bit more from your perspectives what the substance is of these plans and what we're seeing already happening. Carmen, if you might take that, and then Dave, perhaps you can weigh in as well.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Carmen Lopez. I'm the Senior Democracy Director at the State Innovation Exchange, and we support and organize state legislators in all 50 states to champion bold democracy forms, and we also work on other issues as well. I would answer this question quite simply. What we are seeing across the country is we are seeing legislatures want to prevent people from registering to vote. They want to stop people from voting, and then they want to take over the election administration and destroy the election process. It is that simple. Now we can talk about what the policies are that we're seeing repeatedly within those buckets. So we're seeing preventing the registration of people of color, working people, and young people, using targeted techniques to remove people from voter rolls. We're seeing legislation that prevents third parties from engaging in voter registration. We are seeing states take registration offline and back to pen and paper. We see places like Texas pretending that they have a paper shortage and suddenly being unable to print registration forms just before the primary. We're seeing an increase in signature requirements and voter ID requirements for new registrants. I would put all of those under the registration umbrella, and under the voting umbrella, we see geographically and racially targeted reduction of drop boxes. We see a reduction in early voting times. We see an increase in signature verification and voter ID requirements. We see states rolling back mail voting and increasing requirements associated with submitting mail ballots. We see a targeted reduction in polling places, hours, and general access to voting on election day. So basically every part of registration and voting that it is possible to target and roll back, we are seeing somewhere. We're also seeing the sabotaging of the administration of elections. This is a much deeper, much more cynical, and much more troubling trend than we have ever, than I have ever seen in my lifetime. And the most recent is changing election administration and certification from election professionals to partisan actors, and fundamentally changing the way that elections are being run in counties throughout the state. And I'll go into a little bit more detail later, but that's the broad overview of the policies that we're seeing.
Thank you for having me. This is a wonderful panel. I appreciate Gaby and everybody putting it together, and all of y'all being here. It's a really important topic. I think Carmen has just really brilliantly laid out the state of play, because what we're looking at here is a combination, right, of election subversion and voter suppression, and those two concepts are really intertwined and are working hand in hand. the goal really is to make what happened on January 6th of this year, of the last presidential election, seem like a dress rehearsal for what will happen after the next presidential election. And I think Carmen has just laid out exactly where this is happening on the registration side and then on the voting side. What I would add is that this is happening largely, in many ways, in states controlled by Republicans that are rapidly changing demographically. And what you are seeing is the most targeted efforts happening in competitive, purple, Republican, gerrymandered legislatures controlled, but states in which Latino and Black populations are growing rapidly and becoming even majority-minority states. And all you have to do to really understand this is to look at the 2020 election results. Joe Biden wins the popular vote by 7 million. But really, he wins the Electoral College, even though it's 306-232, by about 45,000 votes in Arizona, Georgia, and Wisconsin. So you're looking at 10,400 and change in Arizona, 11,700 and change, 20,000 and change in Wisconsin. And those states have got 37 electoral votes. You've got a 269 tie. Imagine the kind of constitutional chaos and mischief that could have happened with a tie. And then you've got that single elector in Nebraska, a district that since has been gerrymandered a little bit more on the Republican side. So all of this is aimed in many ways at making the 2024 presidential election possible to be subverted bloodlessly, technically, and perhaps even legally. And that's before we get to Moore v. Harper and the independent state legislative theory and the ability of some of these gerrymandered states to go ahead and try to override the popular will of the people and the dangers there that I know we'll be getting into later.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just would also mention that it's in addition to the laws that have been passed in the areas that Carmen mentioned, and we'll talk about more, there are also the criminalization bills criminalizing various aspects of election administration, which I think is creating a chilling effect on folks who would serve as election administrators and officials. And I want to give a shout out to Run for Something, which is a sister or fellow organization in this space that has a really strong effort right now around recruiting election officials. And then the other thing I'd say is shaping public opinion by trying to normalize the ideas around election subversion by introducing bills that really have no chance of passing, but start to normalize the concepts and get people, primed, if you will, to be willing to consider these sorts of subversive tactics. So in this scheme, state legislatures are, really looming very large, and we've seen a tremendous number of states introduce and even pass bills that would subvert, create the conditions under which elections could be subverted in the future. So, I'd be curious, Cecilia, for your perspective, as well as Malcolm, and then I'll open it up for this question to others on the panel. What do you see as from your vantage point, how state legislatures are sort of looming large in this long-term scheme to first normalize the concepts of election subversion and sowing the seeds of mistrust, introducing bills, some of which have the purpose of passing and some of which are just messaging legislation, and then actually passing these bills and so forth. I'm really curious for your thoughts and perspectives.
Yeah, I think we're seeing varying degrees of rhetoric out of state legislators, some, especially in Arizona, openly embrace the Stop the Steal movement. 2 or 3 of the people who are now on the ticket are, one is running for governor, one is running for Secretary of State, one is running for the U.S. Senate. Obviously, none of those are state legislators, but they're openly embracing Stop the Steal movement rhetoric. The legislator who introduced a very comprehensive election law bill that kind of added barriers to voting there in the state of Arizona, and that my organization is challenging in court. He was on a slate of fake electors there in Arizona. So you have some folks who openly embrace it, and then I think you have legislators, and this is kind of what I see when I look at Texas, who may not openly embrace it, but are taking advantage of this moment when their voters are losing confidence in the system because their candidate lost and is not handling it well, to put it mildly, and is putting out this rhetoric about stolen elections and all sorts of just unhinged conspiracy theories. And so in Texas, I think they kind of took advantage of that to add more barriers, more administrative barriers. Like you said, criminalizing the administration of elections to the point that I think staff in 2 counties just completely quit. There are no election officials in those counties in Texas, as I understand it. So there are varying degrees to which this rhetoric is playing a role in this legislation, whether it's directly, as in some cases, or it's just a moment. It's an excuse to pass what they've wanted to pass.
Yeah, I think everything that's been said so far is so important. And when I think about sister districts and when you laid out your reason for starting and organizing, it's so critical, because I think so much of the conversation we're having right now, it's an inverted conversation. I want Josh Shapiro and John Fetterman to win. I want them to win big. But the reality is, for the things that really matter to us, including protecting the right to vote, their elections are insufficient to meet that challenge. I have sometimes it's the honor, sometimes it's the stress, to be on our state government committee. That committee is in charge of a lot of things, as the name implies, but probably most importantly, all of our election laws. And I've been on that committee since I've been in the legislature, and we can go back to 2019. You have to go back to 2019, where you saw my colleagues engage in a consistent, completely divorced from reality approach of trying to diminish people's faith and trust in the election, period, across the board. And a part of what they wanted to do was to pass what they called at the time the Election Integrity Committee. And when a Republican introduces a bill, just know it does the opposite of whatever the fuck they say it does. This would have allowed them in real time to subpoena ballots, to impound voting machines, and they wanted to actually direct our state police and sergeant at arms to physically compel election officials who should have been counting the votes. They wanted to physically compel them to come to Harrisburg to sit before sham hearings to try to find the proof of fraud that they lied about in the first place. Now, because of the pressure of so many groups and so many activists, and because I have a big damn mouth, we were able to stop them from doing that. And it wasn't because they didn't have the votes. They put out this Scooby-Doo-based press release that basically said we would have gotten away with it too if it wasn't for the crazy liberals and their media allies or something like that. But that did not deter them. And so what they have done is move forward with an approach that chips away, as we talked about yesterday, myself and Sarah and Senator Williams talked about, Pennsylvania's expansion of no excuse absentee mail-in voting was a Republican-led bill. It was bipartisan, but it was a Republican-led bill. I believe almost every member in both chambers voted for that legislation. And so instead of completely throwing it out, they're doing what I've started to call artisanal voter suppression, where they aren't out and out just trying to get rid of the drop boxes, but they will create regulations that effectively get rid of them, but they get to go back and say, well, no, we didn't get rid of them. We're just making sure they're more secure in terms of having a police officer who's just going to stand 24 hours outside of a drop box. I wish we patrolled our regular mailboxes like that. They've also undergone a process of trying to insert some of these things into the Constitution because they're not able to advance it through regular legislation, the most egregious of which is a 4-part constitutional amendment. I think the one that got the piece of it that got the most national attention was effectively banning all abortion in Pennsylvania. But in there, they also tucked in provisions that would be some of the most stringent voter ID that we've ever had, provisions that the Supreme Court here in Pennsylvania has already said is unconstitutional, but they're going to try to do it again. And so they are looking at using the bully pulpit, using legislation, but also using the subversion of our Constitution to try to make some of these things permanent.
Do you mind if I weigh in?
Please.
So a few specific, thank you for the Pennsylvania examples. A few of the worst bills that I have seen come through that we are expecting to see en masse in the next set of legislative sessions. So the Florida bill, so Florida Senate Bill 90, it introduced new broad restrictions on mail voting. And after the election where black voters in Colorado and Florida cast mail ballots at a rate higher than previous years, Florida enacted this bill, which severely limited the availability and accessibility of ballot drop boxes, requires voters to put their state ID numbers or social security numbers on their mail ballot applications without providing alternatives for people who don't have those. It limits who can assist voters with returning their ballots. Georgia has gotten a lot of press, but they banned the provision that like giving food and water while people are in line, and instituted a whole new set of attacks on mail ballots and voting election officials. Texas targeted election workers and restricted mail voting. Montana, and there are a couple of other states that have gotten less press because people weren't really surprised by it. But Montana eliminated election day registration, which people had enjoyed there for years. And during the debate over the law, a Republican state representative openly stated that he wanted to end election day registration because he believed it was being used by young people who were not on our side of the aisle. Gone are the days where euphemisms, side looks, it has become very, very direct and very clear who people are targeting. And I feel like, and we'll talk about this later, but I feel like the antidote is everybody standing up and demanding that is everybody's obligation, right, and freedom to vote, all of us, all the time, in every congregate facility, in every household, everybody who's eligible to vote, every former felon, every person who is 18 who is living with their parents or not, everybody in every elderly facility in this country. Like, it is our job to stand up for everybody in this country who is eligible to vote and expect and demand that all of us vote and not allow this sort of picking off of people that, that somebody somewhere is uncomfortable with voting. And I think you see the targeting when I provide that sort of level of specificity. And I feel like that is the thing that we can do to change this. And maybe it cannot be changed, but I have been working on voting in elections my whole life, and I think that we can change it, and I think this is the right group of people to be in this conversation.
Absolutely. And, it's wild to hear, sort of listed out the bills and the ways in which these are aimed at politicizing elections, politicizing election administration, criminalizing election administration, potentially, and interfering with elections, all three of those. And it relies, just as Malcolm was saying, on the narrative, which often comes first, right? Structures follow ideas. So, and just from marketing, right? You need to hear a brand 7 times before you might consider buying it. That a lot of these elections and sowing the seeds of doubt in our election administration takes a long time. You need to tell people that the election was stolen many times before they start to believe it, and all of that is coming down the pike here. And certainly we've seen a tremendous number of states actually implement this state legislation to criminalize and interfere with elections. I know, Dave, you mentioned Arizona and Wisconsin, where the very, very narrow margins led Joe Biden to victory. Just earlier in the year, when I ran these in like June or so, Arizona and Wisconsin had introduced or enacted 31 and 37 election subversion bills, respectively. So 31 in Arizona and 37 in Wisconsin. It's not going to take too many of those bills passing in just 1 or 2 of those states to really change the outcome of the 2024 election, or frankly, the 2022 elections. So then the question is, well, how is this possibly constitutional? How could state legislatures, be able to run roughshod over democracy itself, and be entitled to that as a matter of the federal constitution? And so it's funny, Dave. It was almost a year ago that we wrote our first op-ed together on the Independent State Legislature theory, and at the time, a year ago, it was fringe. No one wanted to publish it, right? Like people were like, "What are you? This is crazy. This is like." This would never happen. What do you mean? And a year later, this theory is not just alive and well, it's going to be argued before the Supreme Court in 2 months. And so, Dave and Cecilia, I'd love your perspective on the Moore v. Harper case, as well as the constitutionality that the Independent State Legislature theory argues exists for state legislatures to essentially have carte blanche over federal elections.
Sure. It's absurd. There's no other way to describe this theory. It's absurd. It's bad law. We should not even be having this discussion. It should be that dumb and not before the Supreme Court. But one thing, so for those of you who are less familiar with it, the Independent State Legislature theory, and I'm really condensing this, argues that because the election clause tasked state legislatures with writing election laws, that you cannot challenge state laws under state election laws under state law, and that those cases would have to go to federal court. Of course, we're only now hearing this now that the courts are benefiting the people who are, or many of the people who are advancing these arguments believe that the courts are on their side, believe that appointees there have been appointments made that benefit them who would be sympathetic to this argument. What I find fascinating about it, it came about, or at least one of its early iterations, came about through a concurring opinion in the Bush v. Gore case that was written by Chief Justice Rehnquist, and that Scalia and Thomas joined. And in it, they argued, I'm again trying to condense this, I don't want to make this legalese and make you all fall asleep, but they basically looked at what Florida law, what the legislature had said with respect to the administrative process of counting votes and various deadlines, and which entities they had given authority to and what authority they had given them, so appellate courts, things like that, when it came to the particular issues that they were looking at. And what I don't understand about Moore v. Harper, sorry, is that? I just know it as Moore. So they are challenging, it is really messy, it's procedurally messy, but the state legislature in North Carolina is basically saying that the maps should be thrown out because the original maps that they drew were challenged by my colleagues at I don't work at Southern Coalition for Social Justice, but I have had the great pleasure of co-counseling with them a couple times on cases in North Carolina. They brought state court claims against the state maps, the initial state maps in North Carolina, and they won under state law. And now the legislature is going to the Supreme Court and saying that this shouldn't be allowed because only the legislature can legally, under the Elections Clause of the U.S. Constitution, only the legislature can draw maps, and that the state courts didn't have any authority to hold them to state law. Now, what I find fascinating about that is in the Bush v. Gore concurrence that even created this theory, they looked to what state law said, who could do what under state law. And in North Carolina law, the courts have been specifically given jurisdiction over gerrymandering cases. So I don't know how this is going to turn out. I do not know why the Supreme Court chose to hear this case. I think that in terms of state legislature theory, it's weak on the facts for what, I don't think it's a good case for getting it adopted, as if that's what they wanted. Again, because North Carolina law gave the courts such a hand in reviewing gerrymandering claims in court. But it's dangerous, and it really, I don't mean to be dramatic, it keeps me up at night.
This is crackpot lunacy, and yet with this U.S. Supreme Court, who is to say that crackpot lunacy will not become the law of the land? There are already at least 4 justices who have expressed an interest in this theory, and I would suggest that there's 5, because John Roberts in the Arizona independent redistricting case back in 2015 is talking about something very similar when he says that the Arizona Independent Commission ought to be unconstitutional because the legislature means legislature, except even if you read into this, a kind of Scalia originalism into the word legislature in the Elections Clause, it's still lunacy, because if you go back to the very beginning and the founders, they made it very clear that their understanding of the word legislature, even in 1789, was the legislative process, and that there was no intention here. And indeed, even at the time, there were state constitutions that oversaw what and limited the kind of power that a state legislature could have. And what the court is effectively looking to do with this case is give unfettered power to legislatures that have already been gerrymandered to hell and back in order to take power of the people to kick their legislators out of office, unfettered control over election administration and election law and election procedure, perhaps even over which slate of electors might go to the Electoral College, and that this would happen without any gubernatorial veto, this would happen without any state court oversight, it would happen without any constitutional oversight, and it would effectively eliminate the ability of the people to undo this through initiative. It's extraordinarily dangerous. It's checkmate in many ways if they are able to do this. In many ways, this is at the heart of what they were trying to do on January 6th, right? To exploit the Electoral College electors in this way, the Electoral Count Act, Mike Pence and the 12th Amendment. And yet, anybody who thinks that they won't do this need only look at what this court has already done over the course of the last decade and the kind of wrecking crew that the Roberts Court has been on voting rights, and I would count Citizens United in that case, in that list in 2010, on into Shelby County, on into Abbott v. Texas, Brnovich v. DNC, of course, Common Cause versus Rucho that greenlit so many of these gerrymanders. So this could well be coming, and we have to think about what it is we're going to do in response. We ought to be having these conversations now.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that just to underline the point, if the Supreme Court green lights a theory that says that state legislatures have the sole and exclusive authority to set election rules and election laws, look at the composition of our state legislatures as they exist now. That, as you know, to draw a line under it, that could be truly a checkmate for the 2024 election. And they wanted to have this case heard before then. They've been itching for an independent state legislature case. I agree, and the scholars at the Brennan Center also find this a little bit of an odd case for them to take on this issue. But as Dave said, the fact that this is an ahistorical reading, a preposterous reading of the Constitution, should give us no confidence in the way that this case will go. So, and the thing is also, and Dave, this is something you've written about, and certainly others, including Jane Mayer, this is part of a long trajectory to build political power in overlooked state legislatures, as well as in the courts, which have also been historically overlooked by Democrats and progressives. And I think we're just starting now to collectively wake up to the importance of state courts in particular. But this is a long trajectory that's gotten us here. And so, Dave, I'd be curious for your perspective on what some of the factors are that have brought us to this moment of state ascendancy where we are so critically underprepared.
Sure. I think you can trace this back, 5 decades. You can trace this back to the Powell memo in many ways, and the way that conservatives understood that they needed a movement-building operation, and big business had to get involved and fund it. And what you see soon thereafter are the rise of the conservative idea factories and think tanks, the growth of conservative news media, the Federalist Society coming out of the late 1970s and the early 1980s and really growing into the force that it has become. And then I would fast forward ahead to the redistricting operation that Republicans put in play in the 2010 elections. It was called Red Map, the Redistricting Majority Project. I don't think that's probably news to many of you in this room, but the idea was to take control of closely contested, competitive state legislatures in states like this one, like Pennsylvania, where in 2010, the state legislature in Pennsylvania was 102-101. It was that close. To take control of Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Ohio and North Carolina and Florida and Wisconsin and Michigan, if I didn't already say Michigan. And they invested just $30 million in trying to win 107 state legislative seats in those 16 states. And they did. They remapped all of those states in 2011. Democrats have not won back a single state legislative chamber in any of those competitive swing states since. What happens in red states does not stay in red states, and what is happening in Wisconsin and Ohio and Florida and North Carolina over the course of the last decade is directly tied to the redistricting that took place in 2011 that has not worked its way out of the system. In some of these states, it's heading into a second decade, which will be a generation of unfair maps that lock in extreme Republican minority rule. And then you add to that what's happened in the courts on voting rights and redistricting. It's then given all of those gerrymandered legislatures effectively unfettered power already to do what it is that they want to do.
Malcolm, curious for your perspective in Pennsylvania on the trajectory over time that you've seen in terms of Republican power building in the state and particularly in the legislature.
Yeah, when we all think about the corrosive impact of money and dark money in our political process, I mean, look no further than Pennsylvania, where there are no rules in terms of the amount of money that can be donated to any individual state house race or state senate race or state race, period. And the conservative infrastructure has taken full advantage of that. Jeffrey Yass, if you don't know him, he's awful, is a guy who's the primary funder of an organization called the Commonwealth Foundation. And they have injected millions and millions of dollars into state legislative races. There is no counterbalance to the amount of resources that they put into these races. Even when you look at the money that comes from organized labor, which is probably on the Democratic side the primary funder of many races, should be no shock that there is an ongoing effort to try to minimize organized labor's power, because that's the closest we got here in Pennsylvania to somebody taking this on and being a backstop. That power and that concentration of power has also not been limited to the state legislature. They are also looking at taking row offices that don't get a lot of attention. Nobody's going to talk about it on MSNBC or Fox or CNN, but they elected a guy named Tim DeFore, who I think everybody should know. He's our current Auditor General. He is an election denier. The Commonwealth Foundation gave him $1.5 million, and I believe he raised $2 million in the race. When I talked about the things that they're trying to put into our Constitution, one of the constitutional amendments is to put Tim DeFore in charge of auditing all future elections. He came before my committee. It was the first thing he ever did after he got sworn in, was come to my committee. And as you might imagine, I had a question. My question was, did he believe that the election in 2020 was free and fair? This was a statewide elected official who was elected on the same ballot, you know, because apparently progressives and Democrats, we were so smart that we were going to make sure Joe Biden won, Josh Shapiro won, but we're just going to lose all these other seats. I mean, that just, you know, because we just wanted to make it fair and balanced, I guess. And so he said very plainly he wasn't sure, that there are a lot of questions, that we need to really look at this, and that basically he just doesn't have the money to audit them, but if he could, he would. And so what did they do in our state budget? They tried to, in our budget process, tried to slip in, and we were able to defeat it because the governor said he would veto it, but tried to slip in, I believe it was $30 million, to create an Office of Election Audits under his purview, and this guy is bought and paid for by the same people who are funding Doug Mastriano, who then use that money to bust people down. And so we need to be very clear, and Dave and everybody has talked about this. These aren't different people. These are the same people who are making multiple investments in the different organizations and individuals who are going to assist them in the complete restructuring of, well, it won't be democratic order, but the complete restructuring of the governmental order in our country. And Pennsylvania is always the place that they want to try it out.
Yeah, I think it's an incredibly important point. As you say, these are the same people. They have a comprehensive strategy. And something, you know, that Dave, I think you mentioned earlier that the conservatives have done masterfully is invest in ideas, invest in academic beachheads, in the translation, in the organizations that can translate their ideas into policy. And that's something that we have struggled with mightily on this side, and the progressive side. And one thing in particular that come back to this panel is that progressives, at least for the past many, many decades, have really overinvested in federal policies, federal strategies, federal litigation, and completely ahistorical nostalgia for a Supreme Court that gave a shit about anyone besides the wealthy and the elite, and to the detriment of state power building. And so we find ourselves in this moment of state ascendancy where we have put almost all of our eggs into a federal basket in a moment where, the future of our democracy is on the line. So that's a lot about the sort of democracy torching actions that state legislatures have been engaged in. But I'm curious to hear from Cecilia and from Carmen. Maybe Carmen, you can go first. What are some of the pro-democracy actions that states are taking that might be able to give us a blueprint a little bit for the road ahead as we come to grips with the fact that election law and voting rights are going to continue to be creatures of state law primarily?
So I think that all the wonderful things that have happened in state legislatures over the last several years have been about enfranchising groups of people who should be registered and should be voting. So a few examples of that are restoring the freedom to vote for people completing their sentences both in and out of prison. So Washington State, Connecticut, and New York are now among 21 states where people convicted of felonies automatically regain the right to vote upon their release from incarceration. There are a set of states that are mid-campaign in ensuring that people in jails and prisons can vote who are already registered and who are already eligible, including prison guards and including everybody else in the prison. Cook County in Chicago is a great example, and it's really exciting to listen to people talk about their personal experiences of being able to vote. It's really inspiring. Mail voting in Nevada and Hawaii. So they're among 35 states with no excuse absentee voting. And, Nevada, very democratic state, very committed to not enabling mail voting until COVID. And then they did it, and it worked really well, and they were very excited about the level of participation, and so they made it permanent. Nevada and New Mexico joined a group of 21 states to enact same-day registration. Washington and Rhode Island recently passed legislation to stop prison gerrymandering, which is the practice of redrawing legislative districts around prisons to strategically and cynically redirect resources and political power. And there's a lot of exciting work happening around the state, that's sort of mid-campaign work on that as well. So those are some of the exciting pieces. And I wish I had included, but I didn't think to, places that are having college campuses be polling places and setting up the entire registration, voting, and counting process on college campuses. I was at the Funders Committee for Civic Participation and listened to some really exciting work that students were doing to make that happen in their states. So those are a few things I'll mention.
I'll also add to that list. So Massachusetts just passed the Votes Act, and it makes mail voting, you don't need an excuse anymore to vote by mail. And it expands early voting options. Delaware just passed no excuse mail voting. So that's really exciting. That's going to make their elections far more accessible, both in terms of people with disabilities, but also just to everyone in general. And then I do want to shout out the advocates out there who showed up at the Georgia legislature, who showed up at the Texas legislature. Some of my friends at Texas Civil Rights Project were at the Capitol testifying for 24 hours. Like, they really do things that they're just amazing when you think about it in those terms. But anyway, they stopped those bills from being worse than they were going to be. Those legislators were really ready to pass something far more suppressive. And advocates showed up and stopped it, or at least raised enough attention to these really horrible provisions within these bills that they were changed. And then the last state I'll call out is Kentucky. So many people, they were one of the states where they have a Democratic governor, they have a Republican Secretary of State. They came together and wrote a series of election rules for the primary and then eventually for the general election to make voting safer during the pandemic. One of those options was to offer early voting to everybody. Previously, you had to have an excuse to vote even early in person, and it was so popular. Yeah, thank you. It was so popular that they subsequently, after the 2020 election and last year, passed a bill that gives 3 days of no excuse early in-person voting. It's not as comprehensive as we as voting rights advocates would want. I would love to see no excuse mail voting, but it's a start. It's something positive, and it's worth extolling.
And I think that's a good transition to give each of you a moment to share what you would offer this community as an opportunity to make a difference and be involved. That may be a call to action with a campaign that you're involved in or a candidate who's running. It may be something long-term that you think folks should be doing or having on their radar, or conversations that they need to have. So let's just go down the list. Carmen, if you wouldn't mind starting with that prompt, that would be wonderful.
Sure. So the extent to which each of us in this room and each of us in this country can tie voting and elections to the other issues that are most important to people, I think our ability to do that is more important when talking about voting than talking about voting rights itself. Because although many of us have been working on democracy and voting and elections for a long time, we know from the polling, we know from focus groups, we know from talking to people that that what motivates people are their families, their kids, their jobs, the food that they put on their table, their health insurance. Like it is incumbent upon us as activists, as advocates, to very closely tie voting and elections to all of the other things that people care deeply about and need every single day. And use the freedom to vote messaging that that has come out of all of the the recent work over the last 10 years. People believe in the freedom to vote. They believe it's a freedom. They do not think it's an obligation. They don't think it's a privilege. Like really thinking about and talking about voting as a freedom to be protected is important for people. And then the action that's associated with that is voting, encouraging everybody else to vote, and at every moment that's possible, remembering that this is a democracy and that it only works when we all participate, including all the people that we don't like.
The question of whether this multiracial nation can ever become a multiracial democracy is a long one. It has been with us since the very beginning of this nation, and it is the same fight that we are engaged in right now. And I think what we have to keep in mind is the long historical sweep here. Prairie View A&M University, where in Waller County, Texas, where students have been intimidated for registering at their college address, where the university has been carved up 4 different ways in various redistricting strategies, where early voting centers have been moved to the far reaches of town. And of course, this is where Sandra Bland wound up dead in a jail cell for failing to signal a lane change. And you wonder why students maybe don't want to travel 20 miles to the early voting center. Waller County, Texas, is where the Confederate Army planned to make their last stand in April and May of 1865. It's where the courthouse still talks about that last stand, poignantly about the men who sadly had to walk home, the fight over. The fight was not over. This is the exact same fight. The court rulings that are coming down from the U.S. Supreme Court on voting rights, they echo almost frighteningly the cases that this court used to end Reconstruction back in the 1870s. This talk of, well, things have changed, and haven't things changed enough? And states' rights. We're in a long-term fight, and we have to view it that way. This is the work of a lifetime, and it's going to extend far beyond us. And what's at stake here really is the kind of nation we want to live in.
You know, to plug Dave's book, I don't know if we're rat fucked just yet. We have some real opportunities, and I think what's also, you know, heartening for me is the reality that we have the power to win these races. It's about utilizing our power and our effort strategically and being more thoughtful about where we spend our time and our energy and our resources. I think sometimes about, these folks are my friends, but who are running for federal office, and you look at some of the money that they're able to raise in one day online or whatever the case may be, that could fund 10, 12, 14 entire state house campaigns. And so I would just encourage you to look at the state that you're in, and if you're not in Pennsylvania, or even if you are in Pennsylvania, obviously I would be the squeaky wheel here and say Pennsylvania is the most important. But seriously and critically, when we talk about that constitutional amendment process, if Republicans lose the state house in November, which we have a real path to do, in part because, Carmen, when you mention prison gerrymandering reform, in this last gerrymandering process, we got, for the first time, some real prison gerrymandering reform. We got some people who are incarcerated counted back where they ought to be counted in the first place, and also just un-gerrymandered the lines in a way that we had not seen in Pennsylvania in a very long time, which creates a real opportunity. But it also means that your networks, the people who are looking at you every election to see how should I best be engaged, I think directing them to some of these state legislative races, directing them to the fact that protecting the freedom to vote, to Carmen's point as well, is about protecting all of our freedoms. And we have a chance to do it. And if we can win here in Pennsylvania, then I think it creates a blueprint for us to win in other states that might seem out of reach or might seem endlessly purple or might seem whatever. We are a place where I think we begin to turn the tide, and that's why I'm so excited to have Netroots here and so excited that you came to this conversation. Thank you.
And I will phrase this in a nonpartisan manner because Fair Election Center is a 501c3. But if you are someone who cares about the freedom to vote, if you are someone who cares about things like equal access to education, equal access to quality health care, you name it, one thing that I see that drives me up the wall is there are areas in this country that people just seem to have given up on. They just say, they're not worth our time, they're not worth our money. Or the one thing I hate more than anything is when people just write off southern states and they say, well, they made these stupid laws and they, do stupid things, win stupid prizes or play stupid games, whatever. Sorry, I ruined it. However, what those arguments overlook is that the South has the largest black population in this country. And you cannot be a progressive and claim that you care about people of color, that you care about people living in poverty, but in the same breath say, I don't care about those states. I don't care about those communities. Thank you. Not everything, just because you can't win a federal office from those states or certain regions in those states doesn't mean you don't put the effort in to try to make sure that every voter there can vote or wants to vote or is energized to vote. There are local elections. Those are the elections that you all know touch us the closest. And if you, what Carmen said, if you can make it, tie elections to those things people care about, people are going to turn out. And good things happen when people turn out and vote, regardless of, or even across the political spectrum. We saw that in Kansas, a wonderful result there, that it wasn't just a red and blue thing. So don't give up on certain areas. Don't make assumptions about what people think there. Some of them just might not feel engaged because no one gave them the time of day to tell them why they should vote, or they might be too busy in their day-to-day life. Let's invest in every voter and make every community reflective of the people living there.
Absolutely. And in closing, I just want to key off of a couple of things that folks said. I want to say something about ideas, I want to say something about money, and I want to say something about winning. On ideas, there's been some, I want to just tease out a theme here, which is that I think that conservative ideology has a deep connection to state power in a way that progressive ideology does not. Ideas come before structures. And part of the reason I would argue that we're in such an institutional hole on the left is that we don't have a conception of progressive federalism. Heather Gerken, who's the dean of the Yale Law School, is a scholar in this area, and I really like what she says, which is that federalism has no political valence as a concept. It's that one party has used it as a tool and one party has not. And I think that that's really important for us to grapple with as we come into this period of state ascendancy, where we need to do some really fast and really deep institution building around state power. So that's what I want to say about ideas. Money. Malcolm makes a great point. I love looking at the FEC numbers when they come out about the overinvestment in unwinnable federal races. One of my favorite things. I mean, it's one of my worst things I hate, but I do it. And so after Q2 of this year, take a guess, just throw it out, what Cook Political considers non-competitive federal Senate races. Guess what Democrats raised through Q2 in uncompetitive federal Senate races? Throw a number out.
30 million.
30 million. How much? 100 million? Anybody else?
300.
$130 million in uncompetitive federal Senate races just by Q2 of this year. In Arizona, anybody want to take a guess what the entire budget of the state legislative program in Arizona was in 2020? $5 million. And they passed an abortion ban this year, and we're only 2 seats away from each of those chambers. Okay? So that's what I want to say about money. Gross overinvestment in unstrategic, particularly federal races. The third thing I want to say is about winning, and this is a call to action. I completely agree that, and we've done a number of research studies at Sister District that show that state legislative chambers are not grossly out of reach for us. As an example, in 2020, we were only about 4,000 votes shy out of many millions of flipping the Michigan House. 4,000 votes. Last year in Arizona, last year in Virginia, we lost the House there by 700 votes out of over 3 million votes cast. These are not unwinnable. The magnitude of our losses does not put building power at the state legislative area out of reach. We just have to be strategic and we have to do it. I'd encourage everyone to do a little bit of work figuring out where your state legislature fits into this puzzle and spend a little bit of time in your activist portfolio working on state legislative races. And I'd encourage you to check out Sister District, where we're working on a number of important state leg races this year. So key to our democracy, the future of our democracy lies in our state legislatures. Thank you so much to our panelists for joining us and for sharing your insights.